Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this event, which has been organised by E3G in partnership with WRI and the Food and Land Use Coalition. My name is Edward Davey. I work for the Food and Land Use Coalition and for WRI. And it's my great privilege and great honour to host a really distinguished panel of speakers and experts looking at the whole question of building and financing climate resilient agriculture and food systems in Africa. This is a timely subject, as you all know, and I'm just going to set the scene for a couple of minutes before inviting our first guest speaker to give his keynote address. Progress has been made, as you know, across Africa to enhance the resilience of agriculture and food systems to climate variability. However, it is clear that further investment in adaptation and building resilience in food and agricultural systems in Africa, as across the whole world, is urgently needed, given the continent's exposure and vulnerability to climate variability and the cascading impacts we anticipate from this changing climate. The International Food Policy Research Institute, IFPRI, estimates that in the order of $1.7 billion of additional international finance required every year to support agricultural systems and farmers in Africa and the Middle East to innovate and to reform their agriculture in light of the changing climate and to achieve SDG 2, zero hunger. The Russian invasion of Ukraine, conflicts elsewhere in Ethiopia, the humanitarian crisis in East Africa, coupled with the reversal of economic gains during the COVID-19 pandemic, all threaten to further amplify food insecurity in the continent. And with climate-induced drought and changing rain patterns already impacting agricultural production, investing in resilience in African agriculture is absolutely key to ensuring food and climate security. And this is a top priority of the African Union, as well as the G7 and the G20. In 2022, as you know, we are in the midst of the African Union's Year of Nutrition. And of course, we have an African COP in only a few months' time in Egypt in November this year. And we know that our Egyptian friends and our AU colleagues are firmly focused on the need for finance, and in particular, the need for finance to support mitigation and particularly adaptation in the continent. We also know there's an opportunity to bridge climate and food security and to create lasting, high quality avenues and funds and mechanisms to support agricultural adaptation in the continent, grounded in an African-led agenda. And so this event will seek to highlight some of these promising efforts to build and finance climate resilient agricultural systems in Africa. And we bring together a range of stakeholders who are committed to sharing promising strategies to drive momentum and to set the bar for action on food and agricultural systems at COP27 and beyond. So thank you all so much for joining. And it's now my great privilege and honor to invite our first keynote speaker to give some opening remarks. This is Dr. Yemi Akinbamijo. Yemi joins us from Johannesburg. He is Executive Director of the Forum for Agricultural Research in Africa. Yemi, the floor is yours. Welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Ed. Yeah, I think my screen is shared now. So thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure and honor for me to be able to be a part of this wonderful event of the London Climate Action Week. I'll be presenting a short keynote on a case for the African Climate Smart Agriculture Framework. But first, I'd like to say a few words on the Forum for Agricultural Research in Africa, the institution that I work for. It is the apex institution, the body that manages agricultural research on the continent. And it is equally the technical arm of the African Union Commission on matters concerning agricultural research and development. FARA does its work guided by 5 function areas. And these 5 function areas contribute to increasing agricultural productivity, improvement of the agro-industry competitiveness, and the enhancement of resilience to risks. This is where this particular initiative comes in into what we do to improve food security, incomes, resilience, and resource management. And then We build upon the successful innovation system approach that we've done in the past and taking on the policies, technologies, partnership, and businesses and converting them through the innovation platform into innovations of technological, institutional, and organizational significance. 2021 was the year when we had the United Nations Food Systems Summit, bringing to fore the pathways to the SDGs. And in the course of the year 2021, a very crucial element that came to the fore for us is that the onslaught of the climate change in Africa is greatly undermining the traditional food production system and livelihoods, thereby putting the population at risk. And this goes a long way to really underscore the very strong impact that climate change has in actually causing us to lose the grounds that we've gained over the years. But the policy leaders in Addis Ababa and the union in general have put in place some mitigating efforts, and I'd like to speak to that in a minute. The first is putting up the Science, Technology, and Innovation Strategy for Africa, what is called the STISA. And the other, which is also much more pointed and very important for what we're doing today, is the recently endorsed African Union Climate and Resilient Development Strategy and Action Plan that was endorsed in February this year during the last summit. So these instruments are very, very crucial to guide our actions and to help us, galvanize actions across the continent and also provide a platform for other partners and decision makers to help Africa overcome these climate challenges. Now, there is what we call ahead of us, what I call the 17 to 27 window. What we have as the Africa and the political engagement since the last COP happened in Durban, South Africa. And we're looking at what lessons have we learned from Durban to Sharm el-Sheikh, which will be the host city for the COP27. So when you look at these two COP events, COP17 and COP27, it is important for us not to fall into the booby traps of the past. So the objective of COP27 and the Africa Pavilion for Africa was to heighten the sensitivity of the African leaders to the vulnerability of Africa to climate change and to encourage them to launch a robust mitigation strategy after COP17. But in preparing for COP27, we have to ask ourselves, are we repeating the same cycles of the last decade, or are we prepared to really define how we're going to run the next decade? So a few things about the lessons from Durban is that Africa did not deliver on the outcome of the Africa Pavilion because the climate change can only be addressed in Africa through concerted science policy development action plans that are tracked, monitored, and measured. Africa must also pragmatically own the African agenda on climate change. And that's the reason we're coming up with the African Climate Smart Agriculture Framework. And then we need to have a stronger coordination, monitoring, reporting, and most importantly, accountability framework. So the most glaring shortcoming of the current measures being implemented in the continent is that despite all that has been done and is being done, we still continue to lag behind other regions in the world in terms of climate change responses. That's not good enough. So the African Union Climate Change Strategy is really set to help us have a well-orchestrated and a coordinated common African agenda on climate change with common targets, indicators, and milestones for a stronger African climate change response. Now, FARA, as the apex institution coordinating agricultural research for development, is very well positioned, and that's why I'm glad and honored to be the keynote speaker to say a few words on what Africa is doing to really put all of these efforts in proper perspectives. So why are we looking for an African climate smart framework? Number one, it is to mitigate the impacts of climate change on the attainment of the Africa we want, which is the Agenda 2063 slogan. So inception meetings on the concept note and the sub components, those concept notes are based on commodities, and we have defined institutional roles and responsibilities leading up to COP27. The multifaceted FARA Science Week, featuring the biennial Climate Smart Agriculture Conference as part of the build-up towards Sharm el-Sheikh, is also one of the key steps. And we have community groups that are really, especially in the context of the TAT and many other initiatives that are looking at commodities across the continent on how we can build resilience. Last but not the least is the incorporation of the Leap for FNSSA, the STISA, and the SDGs 2030. So in terms of the ACSAF, the Climate Smart Agriculture Framework, the goal is to analyze the impact of the African Climate Smart Agriculture on the commodity groups within the regions, to find out what has worked, what has failed, what are the roles of the youth, gender, and the definition of triggers for resilience and disaster reduction strategies for the African food systems. For objectives, the main objective of the framework is the implementation of the purpose-driven process that will deliver a consolidated plan to mitigate the climate crisis and the operationalization of a 10-year frame to guide the ACSA, the African Climate Smart Agriculture, for the next decade. And that will position Africa for a meaningful climate resilient Africa. In principle, it will operationalize the global demands of the African Union Climate Change Strategy 2030. So what is in the action plan? So what you see, this matrix, the regional consultations with the 1CG, the science group, the biennial conference that is led by FARA, Youth and Gender, the Water Dialogue, the Science Soil Initiative for Africa, and all of these are the key components that will constitute the key elements of our strategy going forward. So the expected outcome would be in three folds. One is the establishment of a carefully thought out, multi-stakeholder owned African Climate Smart Agriculture decadal framework that corresponds to the African Union Climate Change Strategy. Second is the harmonization of actions for coherent delivery of the African Climate Smart Agriculture for the transformation of African agriculture. And finally, it will be for the establishment of new partnerships for technical and financial support for African climate smart agricultural research. I want to say thank you very much for your time, and I now revert back to you, Ed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yemi. That's been so helpful in setting the scene for today's discussion. A question came in for you, and I'd like to ask you to respond briefly, from Nina Hisson. What do you think needs to happen for African governments to deliver on the commitments that they signed at COP26? Nina's working with African governments on these and notes that delivery is in some instances lacking. What could incentivize better climate action across the continent?
All right, well, thank you very much. COP27 is sentimental for me. Why? Because as you saw in my presentation, I referred to COP17. And that was a COP that I was personally involved in my capacity as head of agriculture and food security at the African Union at the time. And we thought that we would turn the tide through the African pavilion, and the leaders made very nice commitments, but these commitments became stillborn almost immediately. So what happened was that we did not put in place a mechanism that can help us sustain the momentum. I mean, policy leaders, they come and go and they change, things happen. What we'll be doing different this time around is having this framework with multiple partners, donor funders, technical, political, a lot of NGOs, and so a lot of stakeholders coming in. The African Climate Smart Agriculture Framework, which is a 10-year program for us, will be something that will help us to sustain the engagement of political leaders. It will be tied to the African Biennial Review of Malabo. It should be tied to the reporting mechanisms of the CADEP, which is the overall blueprint for agricultural development on the continent. And because FARA is leading this, the onus is on FARA to ensure that we deliver on the science that will help us overcome the climate issues, and then to track and monitor these as we go along.
Thank you, Yemi. Thank you so much. And thank you for your keynote. It's been wonderful to hear from you. We're now going to open it up to a panel discussion. And it's my great pleasure to invite our three panelists to gather around the proverbial fireplace for a fireplace discussion for the next 25 minutes or so. And there's some questions coming in. Please do keep your questions coming, our colleagues on the line. We want to hear from you. So we have Susan Chombe, Director of Vital Landscapes for Africa, based in Nairobi for WRI, the World Resource Institute. Andrew Mude in Abidjan, who's the lead of Agri SME Development and Innovation Finance for the African Development Bank. And Anne Vaughan in Washington, Senior Advisor for Climate Change at the Bureau for Resilience and Food Security at USAID. And I'm going to speak with them each in turn and then encourage a dialogue between us with the question. Susan, I've got three questions for you and your fellow panelists, and you can answer any or all of them in the way that you see fit. What are you doing to support and finance climate resilient agriculture and food systems in Africa? What are your expectations for COP27, and how do you think COP27 can be a turning point on this agenda? What's the one thing that we really need to see progress this year that will set up long-term success? I'm offering you all three questions now. We can go back and forth now for the next 10 minutes or so. Susan, over to you.
Thank you so much, Ed, and what an honor to be part of this panel and to join in this discussion. First of all, what we are doing. Let me first say what is happening in terms of the food systems. From where I'm sitting, I'm based in Nairobi, but our work with WRI Africa spreads across many countries in Africa. Many parts, especially the Horn of Africa right now, is under food crisis, rising food prices. We are experiencing suppressed rainfalls and therefore experiencing food shortages. But apart from that, it's expected that things are going to get worse before they get better. So we know very well that whatever projections have been made under the UNFCCC and reports on climate change, IPCC reports, that climate change is going to have regional variability in terms of impact, and that the continent of Africa is going to be worse affected. It's not just theory, it's now in practice. We can see it. The droughts, the flooding are becoming more frequent and more intense, and communities are suffering. Currently, it's estimated at least 10 million people, Ed, 10 million people are facing hunger and at the risk of starvation. Now, there are a list of compounding effects. Climate is a big driver, but of course, we are aware, as you mentioned in the beginning, that the conflict in Ukraine and in Ukraine has had reverberated effects on the African continent. We are seeing rise in terms of prices of fertilizers, rise in terms of commodities such as wheat, which are imported from that part of the world, and therefore really showing also how the global connectedness of our food systems can actually affect local people on the ground. So with that, I'd like to say that it is real. We are facing a real challenge. And so the call for action is urgent, it is required, and the call for financing food systems is actually now at a point where it's not just about building resilient food system, which is a medium long-term investment, but also addressing a humanitarian crisis around food and food insecurity on the continent. As WRI, we have partnerships, different kind of partnerships. As I mentioned in the beginning, when I just joined, I just came for a meeting under the FOLU Coalition National Platform in Kenya, where we've joined hands with institutions such as AGRA, such as GAIN, in really building, bringing other partners that are working on food systems to see what can be done. There are three key areas I'd like to highlight. First of all is on the link between food and nature. WRI has been a key partner in forming the AFR 100, which is basically an ambition to restore at least 100 million hectares in Africa. most of that restoration is going to happen on agricultural lands. 65% of agricultural land in Africa is highly degraded. And so it means that restoration practice is going to be largely happening on agricultural lands. And this has a significant effect on food production, because if we restore land properly, for instance, with sustainable land management practices, forestry, such as regenerative agriculture practices, then you're building soil organic matter, you're building soil productivity, and you can have impact on increased food security, and you can build resilient food systems. So as WRI, we are really integrating the food agenda within the restoration agenda, not only to catalyze food production, but also do it at scale, because as I mentioned, AFR 100, so far more than 30 countries, 30 governments have committed to restore lands in Africa, totaling about 100 million hectares by 2030. So if we can even achieve half of that, it is a significant effect towards really addressing resilient food systems. Secondly, we are working on food loss and food waste. You know, a lot of actors don't think that there's a lot of food loss and food waste that is happening on the African continent. WRI published a blog on 3 key ways to tackle food loss and food waste, focusing on Africa. And we saw that at least we are losing food loss and food waste estimated at $40 billion per year. That is more than Africa receives in terms of food aid on the continent. And of course, by addressing food loss and food waste, you create loop feedbacks, in terms of addressing the resources. You basically address the resources that would have otherwise been wasted. So for instance, if we can address food loss and food waste, we don't need to extend our land area into natural ecosystems. So we are saving on natural ecosystems by addressing food loss and food waste, not to even mention that it is incomprehensible to be having that significant amount of food loss and food waste in a continent that at the same time we are talking about 100 million people going hungry. So it's really creating those loopholes, linkages in addressing food loss and food waste to catalyze food security, but also to protect nature and to reduce the amount of resources that we need to produce food overall. Last but not least, we are looking at the aspect of trade. Trade is important. Again, it enables access of food from areas where food is being produced to areas where there is lack of food. But also we know trade is a very complex issue. We have global trade, which is trade between different countries, different regions. And that one, we have looked at it historically and tried to understand how can we make global trade, be able to enable access of food to the very local level. As I mentioned, we can see conflicts in Ukraine destabilizing food supply chains around wheat. So it is a key issue that we need to look. But in WRI Africa, what we are trying to look at is also the Africa for Free Continental Trade Agreement, which was recently 2 years ago enacted, but also the framework now starting to fall in place. How can we see movement of food and trade between countries where there's a surplus in terms of production, being able to reach areas where there's shortages in terms of food production? So in a nutshell, that's what we are working on. I know it's a lot, but happy to come back to points, a bit of details later.
Thank you so much, Susan. That was wonderful and a really helpful opening set of remarks. I'm going to come back to you, but I'm going to invite Andrew now to come in and give us some thoughts of your own, Andrew, on the challenges as you see it, the priorities, and the journey to COP27. Andrew.
Thanks so much, David. I think this is a hugely important conversation, and it's a great pleasure to be amongst this esteemed panelists pushing their fight in their own right. I think from the point of view of the African Development Bank, I mean, if you look at the remarks by Dr. Yemi, I think if we have COP37 in Abidjan, let's say, we do not have the luxury to say that we had good ideas and good plans, but we failed. We just don't have that luxury anymore. I think we have the benefit of a lot of lessons. So lessons such as you said, creating clear mechanisms that can sustain this momentum. We talked of the AU climate strategy and action plan. I think also Dr. Susan talked a lot about very important areas in the agri-food system that can help, that present opportunities to fix leakages in the system. I think you talked about almost 30 billion in food and food waste. And I think, Ed, you mentioned earlier that if we had indicated 1.7 billion annually is needed. So you can see a huge opportunity there. So how do we activate these opportunities? I think from the African Development Bank point of view, these types of conversations leading up to an African-based COP27 that comes, as you said, a year in which the AU has declared as the African Year for Nutrition, and the government of our host government in Egypt has really highlighted or elevated the importance of food and nutrition by setting out specific days within the broader conversation. So this is really an opportunity, first of all, to turn the conversation and to ensure these mechanisms recognize where the opportunities exist in a significant continent that can really provide a lot of the solutions. We talk about the African continent only providing a minuscule part of the carbon emissions, but it can be, with appropriate investments, a huge sink. It can be a huge food basket already by not only taking advantages of some of these leakages that have been mentioned by investing, but I think in the end, to ensure these mechanisms that are put in place, as frameworks, there's various efforts. I think financing is going to be key, and at the African Development Bank, as I guess one of the premier financial partners of African governments and private sector partners to these governments, one of the key things that our management has put in place over last year as we prepared for COP27 and now for COP28 is a very comprehensive climate change and green growth strategy, which has 3 instruments. A policy framework that's open-ended. It has a 10-year strategy document, and then a set of action plans. But it comes with a clear financing commitment such that at the level of our board and our management, a commitment has been made to ensure that 50% of our operations or 50% of our approved deployments are climate finance compatible, and that 50% of these resources goes toward adaptation projects. And so we're aligning with global standards with other MDBs to really define what we mean by climate finance projects. We are also increasing our ambition to ensure that we raise $25 billion by 2025 for climate finance, and are working with a range of partners. So you would have had our president, Adesina, who's a real champion, not just of climate, but of the integration of food systems within the climate change conversation. And this is why our policy is not just a climate change policy, but it's climate change and green growth. And within that, the key pillars of that is not just green growth. So of course that's agriculture, but it's also recognizing the importance of supporting gender and social inclusion within the frameworks of the food system and the climate change actions. The importance of private sector, and so we are working, for example, with governments to ensure that they shift their resource of subsidy toward actually incentivizing appropriate action and private sector deployment at the local level for entrepreneurship, for research and development and innovation at the local level that can also position itself and incentivize to attract private sector flows, both locally, regionally, and globally. And then a key part of this is also recognizing the interconnection, not just of food systems in climate, but also of other elements such as biodiversity, as has been mentioned, health and nutrition. Recognizing that a lot of our food systems right now are very macronutrient heavy, so more about calories, which also is has a relatively a negative impact on climate vis-a-vis a shift toward more higher nutrition food. And so I think within that, now the question is, how do we work within the framework of COP and within that of our countries that we support? A lot of our resources are deployed through countries, and I think that enhancing the globally endorsed framework of meeting the Paris Agreement requirements through nationally determined contributions and the national adaptation plans within those. I think if we can enhance those to have very clear and deliberate food systems indicators and goals, so that concessionary resource climate finance can be can be deployed or mobilized into food systems actions. I think that is something that will be central within COP27, and something that would be happy to work alongside a range of partners to make sure that we can help our regional member countries really enhance their NDCs so we can improve financial flows to some of these actions that have been highlighted previously. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrew. That was a very, very helpful and comprehensive set of remarks. Really appreciated. I'm now going to ask Anne to come in and to give a view from USAID. And Anne, before you launch in, I'll also let panelists know there have been some very good questions in the chat. And I've indicated in the chat where I think some of you can come back to some of these in the next round. But Anne, over to you.
Great, thank you. Thanks so much. I really appreciate the organizers for pulling us together, and already things Andrew was just talking about, would love to follow up and have further conversations with him. And Susan, always food loss and waste is a huge priority, and would love to dig into that. But I wanted to get back to Ed's question on what we're doing, and can speak to what USAID and some pretty exciting announcements, frankly, this week to sort of set the stage, and also would love to make a bit of a call to action also to participants. And I think as was mentioned, and as I think everyone knows, the entire world has been affected by Russia's unprovoked and unjustified war in Ukraine. We know the most immediate needs are in the Horn of Africa, as Susan noted, and there's experiencing a record-setting 4th straight year of drought that may lead to famine, with as many as 20 million people that may face a threat of starvation at the end of the year. Horrible numbers, but hope folks have been able to see that to confront this crisis. Just this week, President Biden and other G7 leaders made some significant announcements to address global food security at the G7. Specifically, just on Tuesday, President Biden announced about $2.76 billion in additional U.S. government funding to help protect the world's most vulnerable populations, mitigate the impacts of Russia's war on growing food insecurity and malnutrition. Of this $2.7 billion, about $2 billion in these supplemental funds will be to help save lives through emergency interventions. And then there's $760 million that will be for sustainable near-term efforts to help mitigate future increases in poverty, hunger, and malnutrition in vulnerable countries that are impacted by the high prices of food, fertilizer, and fuel. These new investments will support efforts in over 47 countries and regional organizations, but will focus on those, especially in Africa, that are most exposed and vulnerable to supply disruptions and price increases. And that's just, you may ask, so what are some of the specific things that we're doing with this money, and also some previous funds over $2.8 billion that we've also released earlier this year. So what are we doing? I'm in the branch of the USAID that deals in development of Feed the Future, and we're particularly excited to talk about the expansion of Feed the Future, which is the U.S. government's flagship global food security initiative. Also announced on Tuesday, we're excited to share that we're expanding Feed the Future's global footprint in 8 new target countries, and all of them which are in Africa, including Democratic Republic of Congo, Liberia, Madagascar, Malawi, Mozambique, Rwanda, Tanzania, and Zambia. This expansion, it continues to deliver on a $5 billion commitment that President Biden made back in September to work on ending hunger, malnutrition, and build sustainable, resilient food systems abroad, including to climate change. And because Feed the Future, it really recognizes that ag, fisheries, food systems writ large are extremely climate sensitive. And through our new global security strategy, we're recognizing that it's harder for farmers around the world to grow the food they need to feed their families because of climate change. So we're elevating our work to ensure climate smart ag approaches are central to Feed the Future efforts. That includes things like Susan mentioned on working more on food loss and waste. And also continuing, I think our Executive Director Faro would appreciate this, and is one of our partners, as well as the 1CG system, is that we've also been working a lot on research and innovations that have had a proven track record in turning research into impacts for farmers around the world. I want to get these numbers right because they're pretty exciting. In 2020, just last year, some of our USAID funded drought tolerant maize varieties were grown on more than 13 million acres by some 5 million farmers in Eastern and Southern Africa. And this year, based on some of our recent seed data, we're hoping to expand that to over 17 million acres. So we're working on trying to have real impact on the ground to help African farmers grow the food to feed their families. And this gets that investment in research and development that has real outcomes for farmers is an example of investments in climate smart food systems that is part of our contribution to something called the AIM4C, or Agricultural Innovation Mission for Climate, which is a joint initiative with the UAE that was announced last year at COP26. And for over 40 countries have joined, over 200 partners now, I think, and the numbers are growing. And through AIM4C, we're seeking to address climate change and global hunger by bringing together participants to increase investments in climate smart ag and food systems over the next 5 years, very much under the umbrella of what we're talking about today. And I just encourage government partners, private sector actors, and NGOs to join or consider joining this community. There's already a lot of African-based organizations that are participating. And as we know, and we've talked about, we need more climate finance in agriculture. And AIM4C is helping try to create partnerships and encourage private sector investments through something called innovation sprints. We have applications open for innovation sprints, which are meant to bring together different partners together to aggregate climate smart ag ideas and finance in support of climate smart food systems. And then in the lead up to COP26, we've got 4 sort of themes that I think might be of interest of these innovation sprints that include how do we support smallholder farmers in low and middle income countries, methane reduction, emerging technologies, and agroecological research. So I would really encourage folks to check out the AIM4C website for more information and sign up if you're able. I think I may have talked too long. I want to, before we get back to like other questions, I want to say one thing we haven't brought up yet is gender. I haven't heard a lot of talk about smallholder farmers and women, or how women can contribute in this. And I think that would be one thing I would like to see out of COP. And making sure that women and marginalized groups are incorporated into everything that we do, and are a voice at the table, and are participating in actions across value chains and the political spectrum is something very important that we're pursuing at USAID and is a priority. Administrator Power, who says climate change is sexist, the response doesn't have to be. So I'd urge us to think about that as we go into COP, and how do we make sure COP takes that and runs with it, because we know there have been cases of climate smart ag interventions, and I would sure hope we're not doing this. So as we think about the finance, can actually cause more work for smallholder women farmers. So let's not do that. Let's think about and have women at the table as we move forward and engage on addressing all of the different challenges that both smallholders are facing and government are facing, especially in the lead up to COP. So I'll stop there, but really appreciate the conversation. Would love to dive into everything from food loss and waste to some of the other topics that we've been covering. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Anne. Brilliant set of remarks. And thank you so much also, rightly, for putting gender at the heart of this discussion. We now have 15 minutes to open it up a bit. And I'm just going to go through some of the questions that have come through and are still coming through, all of which are welcome and really important. So, and I'm just going to invite panelists to come back in a moment and answer 1 or 2 or 3, as many as you can within a few minutes each, effectively. So there's one question about how can European civil society organizations support this body of work and ideas that have come through today. There's a question around voluntary carbon markets and their role in supporting the transition in Africa. There's a question about regenerative agriculture and the restoration of nature and the role of regenerative agriculture in transforming food systems. Susan, I'm sure you might want to come on to that. There's also questions and reflections on AGRA. Colleagues might wish to reflect on AGRA's role in this and the transition that AGRA is undergoing. As Anne referenced, there's a question about food loss and waste. Where is it happening and what kind of solutions are needed to tackle it? And then there's another question, another very good question from Nina Hisson about opportunities at COP27 to push action on climate and food security. As Anne referenced, there's the G7 commitments on food security, the 4 billion. But what's the window of opportunity to take this forward towards the COP? And Mike has also asked about climate finance and how to address the data bottleneck in Africa, which is needed to secure asset class credit security and verification that would enable investment at scale from the carbon finance world and carbon markets. So there's a lot there. I'm going to come back to Susan and then Andrew and then Anne. And at 5 minutes to, I will introduce our distinguished closing speaker who will close this session. But Susan, back to you. Further thoughts?
Lots of good questions there. Let me perhaps tackle the one on ag and regenerative agriculture and the role of those in building, nature. And I think, regenerative agriculture primarily focuses on basically regenerative system, regenerating the soil. We know very well, as I mentioned, a lot of our agricultural lands are degraded, and that means that we have lost key nutrients that would support both growth of the crops, as well as basically the nutrients that we would get as human beings once we consume the end product. And so regenerative systems, essentially, when you focus on the aspect of regenerating soils, it's very, very crucial because if we continue in using, for instance, excessive use of external inputs can lead both to soil acidification as well as negative environmental impact. So you want to transition. We are not saying that we have to stop using, for instance, synthetic fertilizers immediately, because that would have catastrophic effect on productivity. But you do want to have a transition pathways that builds the soil productivity, that builds soil health, so that you can be able to have both sustainable productivity, but as well as positive impacts on the environment. So it's very important that we get that balance right, and we don't get caught up in trying to define very clear systems, because naturally, you look at where you are, you look at where the soils, how far the soils are degraded, and what needs to go into that soil, and that's where regenerative systems can be able to help. Same with landscape restoration. When you're looking at restoration, basically you're looking at what kind of ecosystem services have been lost. Is it soil fertility? Is it water that you want to improve soil water retention, water retention capacity? And you look at those ecosystem services and you look at what are the key ways that you can be able to restore them. So it's very critical that you do agriculture in a way that is both compatible with nature, but restoring the land that we are currently already cultivating, already using, is crucial, because the last WRI report that we released on the extent of cropland in a cropland area in Africa, it shows, we are increasingly seeing cropland extending into natural ecosystems, simply because if we are not helping farmers to improve soil fertility, to improve soil health in areas that are already cultivating, then once those areas become exhausted in terms of soil health, they move to areas that would otherwise be been occupied by nature, especially in the Congo Basin. Shifting cultivation in countries like DRC is a key issue. So I think that's how I'd like to link those to ensure that it's very, very important that we think about it and at least avoid purist narratives and try to look at where do we have evidence in terms of soil health decline, and what are the key ways that we can be able to regain that soil health and therefore transition to more sustainable systems. On the question on food loss and food waste, it's a very good question. There are lots of estimates that exist out there in terms of where food loss and food waste was happening. Traditionally, the narrative has that in Africa, we have a lot of food loss that happens at post-harvest period, from the farm when the crop is harvested to when it's stored and before it's sold. Now, the latest UNEP report actually that was released, I believe last year, was showing there's actually not a significant difference in terms of where food loss and waste is happening along the food supply chains, and especially between developed and developing countries. There's just as much that is being lost post, even at the table, and past that in other places that we never thought about. So what we are trying to do right now as WRI and partners is to realize that there's a lot of data that is missing in terms of the critical points of food loss that can be able to drive actionable and policy and action at national and subnational level. There are estimates at regional level, there are estimates at global level. There are targets, for instance, SDG 12.3 puts target of halving food loss and food waste by 2030. And when we look at national level, we are not seeing similar traction in terms of having national targets. And then you have to really scale down to even subnational targets, and then work with actors to identify those critical food points of food loss and food waste. So what we are doing is using already tools that exist, protocols that exist on assessing food loss and food waste, contextualizing them to the national and subnational level, because these ones are usually made at higher level, and rarely are they relevant to actually look at where food loss and food waste is happening at national and subnational level. So contextualizing that and then working with different actors, government, private sector, local community actors, to really then address food loss and food waste is going to be the key next step, and not just leave it as at that abstract level of we know how much food loss is happening, food loss and waste is happening, but not exactly where and at what point, and including in which value chains. So we are targeting several value chains: fruits and vegetables, dairy, fish, and the key value chains and cereals. Did I mention cereals and grains? Because that's important. That's a majority of where our food production is coming in. So I just want to say, yes, we have abstract numbers, but we need to go into the details.
Thank you so much, Susan. Since I gave the questions, there are two I want to draw Andrew's attention to, in addition to the ones I already raised. There's one from Elliot Gillings. How can governments in EMDES and LICs work together to increase the flows of climate finance for food security in the midst of rising borrowing rates? And then there's a question, Andrew, in your direction from Francesco Rampa, who's an advisor to the Italian government. Is there coordination and policy coherence between the new $1.5 billion African emergency food production facility focused on fertilizer and the $25 billion Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program? And he observes that too much or inefficient use of fertilizer can harm the resilience of the food system. So Andrew, you may have already prepared responses to the other 5 questions in your 4 minutes, but you've got 2 others to think about there.
Well, thanks. So this is a hugely interesting conversation and interventions. I think we wish we had a lot more time to go into this. I also have a few questions and some follow-ups I would have liked myself, but I think the opportunity of this conversation is in the follow-up that can, that can also happen. I think so. Let me tackle the question about the policy coherence first. Within the specific, Susan and Alia talked about the current crisis that we are facing as a result of course, of the increasing food prices due to the conflict in Ukraine, and we have to respond to that. And so this is recently the bank's board approved a $1.2 billion emergency food program that has to be deployed. The question around fertilizer, I think Susan answered that already quite well. I think we can't be purist. I think we also, as we talk about a just energy transition, we have to talk about a just food transition. And for that, until we improve the types of fertilizer we will need to use fertilizer, but there are other integrated, soil management actions that can be taken to limit the requirement, but we do need to production. And I think with regards the policy coherence, I think there's a broader question here, and the question is, I think Ed, earlier in your remarks, you highlighted that we are going to continue to be facing increasing crisis and going to be called to respond increasingly to this crisis. We cannot turn our attention away from the investments that we need to make to ensure greater resilience. This is a challenge that we face, and we need to be cognizant about. And within that challenge, you might find some incoherence arise, because you might, with limited resources, sometimes are called to redirect those resources to emergency. So how do we deal with that? I think a combination of improving the resources available and ensuring we deploy them more effectively, but also improving the link between development and humanitarian, or making this humanitarian actions a bit more amenable to support in more efficient ways, whether it's leveraging the private sector or otherwise. In talking about, I think there's a question about the private sector, but I'd like to respond to this from the important point made about the carbon markets and the opportunities for structuring carbon markets, because I believe this is hugely important. Africa has a real opportunity, and there are some countries that are leading this. In Gabon, for example, there's an instrument around a carbon bond that is based on both regulation and a set of instruments that aim to signal credibly the actions to tap into or to secure the Gabon forest and its great capacity to act as a mitigant and be able to price that out in the market. And this can be done. There's the big effort around the Great Green Wall. I think missing the opportunity to monetize that and link it to carbon markets would be a problem. And so there's a lot of action toward that. I think we can improve actions toward this by integrating them systematically within, for example, some of this national level infrastructure that is already there to help governments, local national governments, think about how they can leverage such opportunities. As I mentioned, through the NDCs, I think the NDC should be a dynamic tool that keeps being enhanced as we improve the capabilities for to tap into such opportunities such as carbon markets. I will leave it at that. Just to finish with another important question that was raised about data, about climate data. All these systems will require good data. I think data is there, but having visibility will need to be improved, and also alignment of the type of standards that require this data, and investments in the systems, digital systems, and otherwise to ensure this will be fundamental as well. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Andrew. We could hear all three of you for much longer, and I apologise to colleagues on the line whose questions we haven't answered, but I think you've both made a very good effort at doing so. And Anne, I'd invite you to do the same, and then we'll close it.
Sure, great, thanks. I wanted just to build off Andrew's point about data is really critical in getting climate information to people, government, people, communities, and decision makers. That is one of the top priorities, and I would say a pillar of something called the President's Emergency Plan for Adaptation Resilience, or PREPARE, which is a whole of government approach that has the target of helping 500 million people become more climate resilient by 2030, and people in developing countries become more climate resilient by 2030. So again, a pillar of that is how do we think about and get the whole of our US government to think more about supporting and partnering with developing countries to get out things like climate information services, early warning, work on the NDCs and support and empower NDCs and other types of plans and programs to be strong. And then the third pillar is around finance, which just builds into, we know a lot of that, that agricultural finance is critically important to help build climate resilience of the 650 million odd smallholder farmers. I wanted 2 points. Susan covered the food loss and waste very, very well. I would note, if folks are interested, that there's a FAO food loss and waste database that you can actually dig into, where it says where along the value chain with best available data there are the biggest losses, and those are great places. And that's what at AID we're looking at, digging into those losses on the value chain, so we can have interventions and work, especially with the private sector, to close some of those gaps and figure out where we need to focus to really make sure we're getting enough food to the table and in families, on families' plates. I also really appreciated the voluntary carbon market question. I think Andrew covered it very well, but would just flag something. If you Google Climate Action Platform Africa, I think that there's work that can be done to help support it within the voluntary carbon markets that are really exciting, that can help empower smallholder farmers. And really, I think the narrative of Africa as a victim, Africa can really help serve and address a lot of different climate opportunities, including how do we help make sure that the carbon markets can help smallholder farmers. And there's a lot of it's hard, it's a challenge, but it's something that I think needs more thought, and appreciate Andrew's comment on that, so we can make sure we're empowering farmers as much as possible and giving them different types of financing so that they can do what they do best, which is grow. And they know climate change is happening, it's real, and have a lot of already good interventions that they can do, but need the finance to do so. And so we need to get creative, because the needs are so great on how to meet those challenges. And then one of those things, I'm afraid I couldn't read the comment about AgriX, what the actual underlying article was. But we know we've USAID's funded a variety of evaluations of agro over the years, but also in terms of crowding in climate finance, agro is hosting a deal room in September to help bring in more private sector financing to help make sure we're getting the right type of financing to different producers and cooperatives, you name it, and governments around the world. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Anne, and many, many thanks to all three of you. I think everyone would agree this has been a really rich and interesting and stimulating panel, and you've all given a lot of insight and expertise. Thank you so much for that. It's my great pleasure to invite Monica Froehler, who's the CEO of the Ban Ki-moon Center, to make some closing remarks. Monica, thank you so much. And if I may say in closing, thanks to our E3G friends for organizing such a brilliant webinar. Monica, over to you to close.
Thanks so much, Ed. It was indeed a very rich discussion. I will not try to aspire to summarize it all, but let me share with you some of the highlights that I took away. Of course, Yemi talking about the African Climate Smart Agricultural Framework and FARA's work and the need, his very strong appeal for technical and financial support. I'm taking away from Susan, of course, WRI work on the nexus between food and nature and food and waste and food loss, but also the trade component that is also absolutely crucial, but also your call, Susan, for financing the food system. I'm taking with me from Andrew, obviously, the elevated chance by Egypt, by the next COP, about the importance of food and nutrition. So we are talking at the forefront. AFDB has been, with the climate change and green growth strategy, definitely a beacon of hope. And hearing that 50% of the resources will go to adaptation, hearing about your AAAP, the 25 billion that you will try to galvanize until 2025 for a just food transition, and also it is very encouraging. So thanks for that. And it's amazing to hear what the US is doing. US aid, of course, with the G7 promises that have just been made, the announcements of the 2.76 billion, that's encouraging. We're still falling short of the overall promise, but thank you to the US for taking a lead in that one. Feeding the future, you told us about Feed the Future, you told us about Prepare. You raised your voice on Aim4C, and I want to encourage everyone to read up on Aim4C, which was launched with UAE at the last COP in Glasgow. And thank you also for mentioning gender and COP27. So these are just some of my highlights that I took away. And indeed, it is encouraging. We have to build on what was agreed already at COP26. Remember, in COP26, we had the 2-year Glasgow Sharm el-Sheikh work program on the global goal on adaptation. Remember that there was also the Glasgow breakthrough on agriculture that was formulated. We must be built on that. It must be, more must be done, definitely. So with the multiple crises that we are focusing today upon, I'm just wondering, it hasn't been mentioned that it's predicted that our demand for food will increase 50% until 2050, while yields, as you know, will drop to 30. So this discrepancy will be particularly harmful to, of course, first and foremost, smallholder farmers. So if we don't step up to farmers in Africa and Asia, livelihoods of billions of people are under threat. Hunger will increase, poverty will increase, and we will not get the progress of SDG 2 that we really need. So my appeal is to everyone to call on governments, to call on world leaders to commit increasing climate finance, and not only to mitigation, but also to adaptation. G7 last week said we are sticking to the pledge of the 100 billion for climate financing. However, promises are still falling short. In addition to providing finances to climate action in general, we have to also think about the channels. How do we channel these resources? And so allow me to say that if we now, according to the UN, spend 1.8 trillion on adaptation, we would save 7.1 trillion in climate costs later on. So it's very much about the investments now that we are undertaking. Currently, only worldwide, 10 billion are spent per annum on smallholder farmers, but we need 240 billion per year. So look at that gap, and we need to close it. The Ban Ki-moon Center believes that investing in agricultural research and innovation, we can achieve this goal. So channeling more funding into that, into CGIAR, or as FARA said, their programs are delineated, we can accelerate technologies and crops and particularly help the most vulnerable, the farmers. So very much in line with this Global Center on Adaptation and the African Development Bank, the AAAB seeking the 25 billion by 2025 needs to unlock adaptation action at scale. Thanks for already pledging 12.5 billion to AFDB. Likewise, of course, Aim4C, initiated by US and UAE governments, is calling for increased investment in climate smart agriculture. And One thing that hasn't been mentioned so far, there is the Qatar Fund for Development, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation have recently launched the NUNMO partnership, pledging 200 million to supporting smallholder farmers in sub-Saharan Africa. Guided by Ban Ki-moon's leadership, we are dedicated to increase financial and political commitments to strengthen agricultural adaptation and to elevate the resilience of smallholder farmers in Africa, who are struck hard by droughts, heat, flooding, salinity, and changes in the growing seasons. As we move closer to COP27, I really hope that we can seize this chance and raise the bar higher for action on food systems and agricultural adaptation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Monica. Thank you all so much